The sun was setting over the Grand Oasis Resort, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Crystal chandeliers began to twinkle in the massive lobby as staff hurried about, making final preparations for the annual charity gala. This was the event of the season, where the rich showed up to be seen, celebrities made appearances, and business deals were quietly made over champagne and caviar. Nancy, the head receptionist, was checking in the last of the VIP guests when she noticed an unusual figure through the glass doors. An elderly woman stood there, hesitating before slowly pushing open the heavy door. The woman must have been around 80 years old, with silver hair tied back in a messy bun. Her clothes told a story of hardship: a faded blue sweater with patches at the elbows, worn brown pants that had seen better days, and shoes that were splitting at the seams. The old woman clutched a weathered leather satchel to her chest as she shuffled into the lobby. The contrast was striking. Her worn appearance against the backdrop of marble floors, designer furniture, and guests in outfits that cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Can someone deal with that?" whispered Lily Harper, a regular guest known for her generous donations and not-so-generous personality, pointing a diamond-ringed finger toward the elderly woman. The old woman, Eleanor Walker, seemed not to notice the stares as she made her way slowly across the lobby. Her eyes, a clear blue that hinted at a sharp mind, took in the surroundings with quiet interest. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth as she watched the wealthy guests mingling, laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Two security guards exchanged glances, unsure whether to approach her. Before they could decide, Blake Thompson, the resort manager, noticed the commotion. His practiced smile faltered for just a moment before he straightened his designer tie and strode purposefully toward Eleanor. "Excuse me, ma'am," Blake said with a strained politeness that didn't reach his eyes. "Are you lost? This is a private event." Eleanor looked up at him, and for a moment, Blake felt as if she could see right through his practiced facade. "No, young man, I'm not lost," she replied in a voice that was surprisingly strong. "Just a bit tired from my walk. Would it be possible to sit down for a moment?" Blake's smile tightened. "I'm afraid this is a private venue tonight. Perhaps I can call someone to assist you to a more appropriate location." By now, several guests had paused their conversations to watch the unfolding scene. A group of young socialites huddled together, phones discreetly aimed at Eleanor. "Did she walk out of a dumpster?" one whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Imagine paying 5 figures for a ticket and having to share the room with homeless people," another replied with a snicker. In the corner, a young waitress named Rita watched the scene with growing discomfort. She balanced a tray of champagne flutes while biting her lip, clearly torn between her job responsibilities and her desire to intervene. Eleanor either didn't hear the comments or chose to ignore them. She simply stood there, one hand resting on her satchel, the other gripping a simple wooden cane. "I only need a glass of water if it's not too much trouble," she said to Blake. "Then I'll be on my way." Blake's eyes darted around the room, noting the important guests who were staring. The annual charity gala brought in millions in donations and business connections. He couldn't risk anything disrupting it, especially not some homeless woman who had somehow slipped past the front gate. "I think it would be best if you left now," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He gestured supplely to the security guards, who began moving toward them. "This is a private property." Eleanor's eyes briefly reflected something, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation, before she nodded slightly. "Very well," she said quietly. As the guards approached, Rita suddenly stepped forward, nearly spilling the champagne on her tray. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "The woman just wants some water. I can take her to the service area and then help her find her way out. No disruption to the guests." Blake looked at the young waitress with surprise and annoyance, but after a moment of consideration, he nodded curtly. "Fine. 5 minutes, no more. And use the back entrance." As Rita carefully led Eleanor toward the service hallway, whispers and mocking laughter followed them. What none of them realized was that the shabby bag Eleanor clutched contained documents that would change everything about the Grand Oasis Resort and everyone in that room by tomorrow morning. Rita led Eleanor through the service hallway, away from the judging eyes of the wealthy guests. The narrow passage was a stark contrast to the opulent lobby, plain white walls instead of marble, concrete floors instead of plush carpets, and the distant clatter of kitchen staff preparing for the evening's feast. "I'm sorry about Mr. Thompson and those people out there," Rita said, her voice low. "They forget their manners sometimes." Eleanor's eyes crinkled with a gentle smile. "Don't worry, dear. I've seen much worse in my time." Her voice carried a hint of wisdom that made Rita wonder about the old woman's past. They reached a small break room where staff took their meals. Rita pulled out a chair for Eleanor, who sank into it with a grateful sigh. "Thank you," Eleanor said, placing her worn leather satchel carefully on her lap. Her fingers, though wrinkled with age, moved with surprising grace as she opened the bag just enough to check its contents before closing it again. Rita filled a glass with water and brought it over. As Eleanor drank, Rita noticed how the woman's clothes, though faded and worn, were clean. Her silver hair, though messy, had been recently washed. There was something about her that didn't quite fit the typical image of a homeless person. "Are you hungry? I could bring you something from the kitchen," Rita offered. Before Eleanor could answer, the break room door burst open. Vanessa Carter stood there, designer-dressed, sparkling under the fluorescent lights, her perfectly manicured hand still on the doorknob. She was the daughter of a tech billionaire, famous for her reality TV appearances and infamous for her treatment of those she considered beneath her. "So this is where you're hiding the vagrant," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with amusement. She held up her phone, taking a photo before Rita could object. "This is going to get so many likes." Charity Gala interrupted by actual charity case. Rita stepped forward. "Miss Carter, you're not allowed in staff areas." "Oh, please." Vanessa rolled her eyes. "Daddy donated $500,000 to this event. I go where I want." She looked at Eleanor with mock sympathy. "Did you come for the free food, Grandma? Or did you just get lost on your way to the homeless shelter?" Eleanor took another sip of water, her face calm. "Neither, young lady. But thank you for your concern." Vanessa's friends appeared behind her, giggling as they peered into the room. "Look at her bag," one of them called out. "Bet that's where she keeps all her worldly possessions." Vanessa stepped closer, her curiosity piqued by Eleanor's unruffled demeanor. "What's in the bag anyway? Collected newspapers?" "Aluminum cans." Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Just some paperwork, my dear. Nothing that would interest someone like you." Something in Eleanor's tone, not angry or defensive but almost pitying, made Vanessa's smile falter for a moment. She recovered quickly, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Well, you'd better finish your charity water quickly. Security's coming to escort you out the back way. Can't have you frightening the real guests," she laughed, turning to leave. "I've already posted the pictures online. People are loving it." After Vanessa and her friends left, Rita's shoulders slumped. "I'm so sorry about that." Eleanor patted Rita's hand. "It's all right. She's young and has never known struggle. That makes it hard to recognize the humanity in others who have." The door opened again, and this time 2 security guards entered, looking uncomfortable with their assignment. "Ma'am, we need to escort you off the premises," the taller one said, avoiding eye contact. Eleanor nodded, rising slowly to her feet. "Of course, I understand you're just doing your job." Rita stepped forward. "Can I at least pack her some food to take?" The guards exchanged glances. "Make it quick," the shorter one said. "Mr. Thompson is getting impatient." As Rita hurried to gather some sandwiches and fruit, Eleanor stood quietly, watching the commotion in the kitchen through the open door. Chefs shouted orders as waiters rushed to and fro with trays of elegant appetizers. In the distance, through another door, she could see the glittering ballroom being prepared for the charity auction. Such effort for one evening, Eleanor murmured to herself, and yet so little real charity in the air. Rita returned with a small package of food wrapped in napkins. "It's not much, but it's fresh." "Your kindness means more than you know," Eleanor said, carefully placing the food in her satchel. "What's your name, dear?" "Rita Gomes," she replied. "I'm working here to pay for nursing school." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "Remember this night, Rita Gomes. Kindness always finds its way back to those who give it freely." As the guards led Eleanor toward the service exit, neither they nor Rita noticed a man watching from the shadows of the hallway. Robert Wilson, the resort's owner, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened to an urgent message from his financial advisor. Robert Wilson paced in his office, the phone pressed tightly against his ear. The charity gala was in full swing just 2 floors below, but his mind was far from the champagne and small talk. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked, his voice tense. He ran his free hand through his graying hair. "There's no mistake." The voice on the other end confirmed what his financial advisor had just told him. Robert's face paled as he looked at the email that had just arrived on his computer screen. There was a photo attached, much younger but unmistakable. "I'll handle it myself," he said firmly before hanging up. He stared at the photo again, then hurried out of his office. Meanwhile, the 2 security guards were walking Eleanor toward the service exit. They moved slowly, matching her pace as she leaned slightly on her wooden cane. "You don't have to be gentle with me," Eleanor said with a small smile. "I've been thrown out of fancier places than this." The taller guard looked surprised. "You have?" Eleanor's eyes twinkled. "Well, maybe not fancier, but certainly ruder." The shorter guard couldn't help but chuckle. "I'm sorry about this, ma'am. Just following orders." They reached the back door, which opened onto a dimly lit alley where delivery trucks usually parked. The night air was cool, a strong contrast to the carefully controlled temperature inside the resort. "Will you be okay out here?" the taller guard asked, genuine concern in his voice. "We could call you a taxi, matey." Eleanor adjusted her satchel. "I'll be fine. The bus stop isn't far." Before either guard could say more, they heard quick footsteps coming down the hallway. They turned to see Robert Wilson himself hurrying toward them, slightly out of breath. "Stop," he called out. "Wait right there." The guards straightened immediately, surprised to see the owner of the entire resort chain in the back service corridor. "Mr. Wilson, sir," the shorter guard said nervously. "We were just following Mr. Thompson's instructions, too." "Never mind that," Robert interrupted, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Where is she going?" "Just following orders to escort her off the property, sir," the taller guard explained. Robert stepped forward, looking at Eleanor with a mixture of disbelief and respect. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, as if confirming something to himself. "Mrs. Walker," he finally said, his voice almost reverent. Eleanor looked at him calmly, revealing nothing in her expression. "Yes." The guards exchanged confused glances. Robert straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "I'm Robert Wilson, owner of the Grand Oasis Resort." "I know who you are, Mr. Wilson," Eleanor replied. "Your picture is on all the brochures." Robert's face flushed slightly. "Mrs. Walker, I've just received a rather urgent call from my financial team." He glanced at the guards. "Could we speak privately in my office?" Eleanor considered him for a moment. "I'm afraid I'm being escorted off the premises." There was a hint of amusement in her voice. "That was a terrible mistake," Robert said quickly. "Please accept my deepest apologies." By now, Blake Thompson had appeared at the end of the corridor, walking briskly toward them. His face showed confusion at seeing his boss with the homeless woman. "Mr. Wilson, sir," Blake said as he approached. "Is everything all right? We were just removing this." "Mrs. Walker is our most honored guest," Robert interrupted sharply, "and she will be treated as such." Blake's mouth opened and closed without words coming out. The security guards looked equally confused. "But sir," Blake finally managed, "she's Eleanor Walker," Robert said firmly. "Majority shareholder of Walker Enterprises and, effectively, your employer." The color drained from Blake's face. Walker Enter. "But that would mean that I own 62% of the company that owns this resort." Eleanor finished for him, her voice still gentle but with a new edge of authority. "Yes, among other things." The hallway fell completely silent. The security guards stared in disbelief, while Blake looked as if he might faint. "I don't understand," the taller guard finally said. "If you own this place, why did you let us?" Eleanor's smile was sad but kind. "Sometimes you learn more about a place by entering through the back door than the front." Robert gestured toward the main part of the resort. "Mrs. Walker, please allow me to escort you to the presidential suite. It's been prepared, though we weren't sure if you'd actually arrive." Eleanor nodded, but then turned to look at Blake, whose face had gone from pale to sickly gray. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I believe there's a young woman named Rita working in your kitchen. Would you be kind enough to send her up to my suite later? I'd like to thank her properly for her kindness." Blake nodded numbly, unable to speak. As Robert led Eleanor away, the whispers had already begun spreading through the staff corridors like wildfire. Within minutes, the news would reach the ballroom, where Vanessa Carter was still showing her friends the mocking photos she had posted online, photos that were about to take on a very different meaning. Word spread through the Grand Oasis Resort like wildfire. Staff members whispered to each other in corners, their eyes wide with disbelief. Guests noticed the strange energy in the air as waiters huddled together, stealing glances at the main elevator where Robert Wilson had escorted the elderly woman upstairs. "Did you hear?" One waiter whispered to another. "That homeless woman is Eleanor Walker." "Who's Eleanor Walker?" asked a young busboy, polishing glasses behind the bar. The older waiter looked around before leaning in. "Only the person who basically owns this entire resort chain. Walker Enterprises has holdings in half the businesses represented at this gala tonight." In the presidential suite on the top floor, Eleanor sat in a plush armchair looking out over the ocean view. The suite was bigger than most apartments, with gold fixtures in the bathroom and a chandelier hanging over a dining table that could seat 12. Robert Wilson stood nearby, still trying to process the situation. "Mrs. Walker, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for the way you were treated," he said, wringing his hands. "If I had known you were coming—" "That was rather the point, Mr. Wilson," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to see how this place really operates." She looked around the lavish suite. "It's been 20 years since I stepped away from day-to-day operations. I wanted to see what's become of my company." Robert swallowed hard. "And what have you seen?" Eleanor's eyes were sharp despite her age. "A place that values appearance over substance, where staff are afraid rather than inspired, where kindness is rare enough to be surprising." She sighed. "Not what I had hoped for." Meanwhile, downstairs in the ballroom, Vanessa Carter was enjoying being the center of attention. Her friends clustered around her phone, giggling at the photos she posted. "Look at all these likes," Vanessa exclaimed. "My post about the old bag lady is going viral." A man in an expensive suit approached their group, his face serious. He leaned down and whispered something in Vanessa's ear. Her smile froze, then slowly faded. "What?" she gasped. "That can't be right." She quickly opened her social media app again, only to find hundreds of new notifications pouring in. People were commenting on her post, but not in the way she expected. Do you realize who you're mocking? That's Eleanor Walker, you idiot. Your dad works for her company. You're so fired." Vanessa's hands began to shake. "This has to be a mistake," she whispered. Her friends, sensing trouble, began to drift away from her. Across the ballroom, Rita had just been told to report to the presidential suite. She stood frozen by the kitchen doors, her tray of appetizers forgotten. "Me? Why would she want to see me?" she asked, her voice trembling. The head chef shrugged. "All I know is that Blake said you to go up there immediately, and he looked like he'd seen a ghost." Rita handed her tray to another server and headed for the service elevator, her heart pounding. As she rode up to the top floor, she tried to make sense of what she'd heard. The homeless woman was actually a billionaire? The owner of the resort? It seemed impossible. When she reached the presidential suite, she hesitated before knocking softly on the door. Robert Wilson himself opened it. "Ah, you must be Rita," he said, sounding unusually humble. "Please come in. Mrs. Walker would like to speak with you." Rita stepped into the most luxurious room she'd ever seen. And there, sitting by the window, was Eleanor Walker. She'd washed her face and combed her hair, but she was still wearing the same worn clothes. Somehow, in this setting, they looked like a deliberate choice rather than a necessity. "Rita," Eleanor said warmly, "thank you for coming." I don't understand what's happening," Rita said honestly. "Everyone's saying you own this place." Eleanor smiled. "I own a lot of things, dear. But ownership means little compared to how we treat one another." She gestured to a chair across from her. "Please sit. I'd like to hear more about your nursing studies." As Rita hesitantly took a seat, her phone buzzed with a news alert. She glanced down to see a headline. "Eleanor Walker, billionaire founder of Walker Enterprises, makes a surprise appearance after 20-year absence." Below was a split image, on one side, an old photo of a younger Eleanor in business attire addressing a boardroom. On the other, Vanessa's mocking photo of Eleanor in the resort kitchen, now going viral for entirely different reasons. Back in the ballroom, Vanessa's father had just arrived, his face flushed with anger as he searched the room for his daughter. The charity gala continued, but now with an undercurrent of tension and excitement. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Why had one of the wealthiest women in the country chosen to appear as a homeless person at their event? And what would happen next? A team of hotel staff knocked timidly on the door of the presidential suite, carrying everything Eleanor might need: fresh clothes, toiletries, even a hairdresser and makeup artist. To their surprise, she accepted only a simple change of clothes and access to the shower. "I can manage my own hair, thank you," she told the nervous hairdresser with a kind smile. "Been doing it for 80 years now." After the staff left, Eleanor stood under the hot shower, letting the water wash away weeks of dust from her travels. As steam filled the luxurious bathroom, her mind drifted back to the path that had led her here. She hadn't always lived on the streets. For decades, she had been Eleanor Walker, founder and CEO of Walker Investments, a company that grew from her tiny office above a deli into a global empire. Her late husband Thomas had been by her side as they built their business from nothing, working 16-hour days and reinvesting every penny of profit. When Thomas died 20 years ago, something inside Eleanor had changed. She found herself sitting in board meetings, surrounded by younger executives who talked about profit margins and cost-cutting measures while ignoring the human impact of their decisions. "What's the point of all this wealth?" she had asked the board one day, "if we lose touch with the people we're meant to serve?" They had looked at her with confusion. One young executive had even suggested she might need some time off to process her grief. Instead, Eleanor had made a radical decision. She restructured the company, placing most of her shares in a blind trust with specific ethical guidelines. She kept majority control but appointed trusted managers to handle day-to-day operations. Then she disappeared from public life. For 20 years, she had lived simply, sometimes in small apartments, sometimes in homeless shelters, and occasionally on the streets. She traveled by bus and train, visiting towns and cities where Walker Enterprises had holdings. She watched and listened, seeing firsthand how her company's decisions affected real people. Eleanor stepped out of the shower and dried herself off. The fresh clothes were simple but high quality, black slacks and a blue blouse. She looked in the mirror as she combed her wet silver hair. Her face showed every one of her 80 years, with deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She had earned those lines. "You look more like yourself now," she said to her reflection. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Rita, bringing a cup of tea. "Mrs. Walker?" "I thought you might like this," Rita said, still slightly nervous in Eleanor's presence. "Thank you, dear, and please, call me Eleanor." She accepted the tea gratefully. "Tell me, how long have you worked here?" "Almost 2 years," Rita replied. "I work evenings and weekends while taking nursing classes during the day." Eleanor nodded. "And how does the resort treat its staff?" Rita hesitated. "They follow labor laws, but there's not much support beyond that. Last month, my coworker Tom needed time off when his child was sick, and they threatened to fire him." "I see," Eleanor said quietly. "And what about the resort's community involvement? The charity gala downstairs, for instance?" Rita's expression told Eleanor everything she needed to know. "It's mostly for show," Rita admitted. "The guests get tax write-offs, and the resort gets publicity. Very little money actually reaches local causes." Eleanor wasn't surprised. She had suspected as much from her observations over the past few days. Walker Enterprises had lost its way, focusing on profit while forgetting its responsibility to people. Meanwhile, downstairs in the ballroom, Vanessa was facing her father's fury. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed, pulling her into a corner. "Eleanor Walker could destroy our family's business with a single phone call." Vanessa's face was pale, her earlier confidence completely gone. "Dad, I didn't know who she was. How could I possibly?" "Fix this," her father demanded. "Find a way to apologize before the damage is permanent." Across the room, Blake Thompson was frantically instructing staff, his usual composure shattered. "Make sure everything is perfect. If anyone sees Mrs. Walker, treat her like royalty." He wiped sweat from his forehead. and find out who was rude to her earlier. I need someone to blame. In the hotel lobby, reporters had begun gathering. News of Eleanor Walker's reappearance after 20 years had spread quickly. Security guards blocked the entrance, but cameras flashed through the glass doors. Back in the presidential suite, Eleanor stood by the window, looking down at the growing media circus. Robert Wilson stood nearby, waiting anxiously for her to speak. "The annual shareholders' meeting is tomorrow morning," Eleanor finally said. "I'll be attending." Robert nodded nervously. "Of course. It's being held in our main conference room, as scheduled." Eleanor turned to face him, her expression resolute. "I've spent 20 years watching from the shadows, Mr. Wilson. Tomorrow, Walker Enterprises remembers its true purpose." Morning light streamed through the windows of the Grand Oasis Resort's main conference room. Men and women in expensive suits filled the rows of chairs, speaking in hushed tones and checking their phones nervously. The annual shareholders' meeting of Walker Enterprises was always important, but today felt different. Rumors had spread overnight, and everyone knew something extraordinary was about to happen. At the back of the room, Rita stood awkwardly in her waitress uniform. Eleanor had personally asked her to attend, though she felt out of place among the business executives. Next to her, several other resort staff members shifted uncomfortably, including the 2 security guards who had almost escorted Eleanor off the property. In the front row, Vanessa sat beside her father, her usual confidence replaced by visible anxiety. She had spent the morning trying to delete her social media posts, but it was too late. Screenshots had already been shared thousands of times. The room fell silent as Robert Wilson stepped up to the podium. "Good morning," he began, his voice slightly strained. "Welcome to the annual shareholders' meeting of Walker Enterprises. We have an unexpected change to our agenda today." He cleared his throat. "It is my honor to introduce the majority shareholder and founder of our company, Mrs. Eleanor Walker." The door at the side of the stage opened, and Eleanor walked in. She looked different today, still wearing simple clothes, but clean and pressed. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and she carried herself with quiet dignity. The wooden cane was still in her hand, but she seemed to need it less. Gone was any trace of the homeless woman from yesterday. This was clearly someone accustomed to commanding respect. Whispers filled the room as Eleanor took her place at the podium. Some of the older board members recognized her immediately, while younger executives stared in disbelief. This was the legendary founder they had heard stories about, but never expected to meet. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Eleanor said, her voice strong despite her age. She looked out at the crowd, taking a moment to study the faces before her. "It's been 20 years since I stood at this podium. I see some familiar faces and many new ones." She placed her leather satchel on the podium and opened it, removing a thin folder. "When my husband Thomas and I founded this company, we had one guiding principle: business should improve lives, not just generate profit." She opened the folder. "Yesterday, I entered this resort as someone society often overlooks. I wanted to see what our company has become when no one thinks the boss is watching." Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "What I found was disappointing," Eleanor continued. "A resort that treats some guests like royalty while ignoring the basic dignity of others. Staff afraid of making mistakes instead of feeling empowered to show kindness. A charity event where actual charity was hard to find." Vanessa sank lower in her seat as Eleanor's gaze briefly met hers. "This is not what Walker Enterprises was meant to be." Eleanor's voice was firm but not angry. "And as the majority shareholder, I am making some changes, effective immediately." She pulled out a document and held it up. "This morning, I signed a new corporate charter with updated ethical guidelines. First, this resort will establish a training program for homeless individuals, providing job skills and stable employment." Murmurs spread through the audience. "Second, 20% of our annual profits will go to community development in all areas where we operate. Third, employee benefits will be expanded to include educational assistance, childcare support, and family leave." Some board members began whispering urgently to each other. One man stood up. "Mrs. Walker, with all due respect, these changes will significantly impact our profit margins." The shareholders. "I am the majority shareholder," Eleanor reminded him calmly. and I believe these changes will make us more profitable in the long run. Businesses that treat people well earn loyalty that money can't buy." The man sat down, his face flushed. Eleanor turned toward the back of the room. "Rita, would you please come forward?" Surprised, Rita made her way to the front, feeling hundreds of eyes on her. "This young woman," Eleanor said, "showed kindness when it wasn't convenient or profitable. That's the spirit this company was founded on." She smiled at Rita. "I'm establishing a full scholarship fund for your nursing education, and when you graduate, there will be a position waiting for you as Director of Community Health Programs for Walker Enterprises, if you're interested." Rita's eyes widened in shock. "I thank you, Mrs. Walker." Eleanor then turned to where Vanessa sat. "Ms. Carter." Vanessa looked up, her face pale. "I believe you have experience with social media. How would you like to put those skills to better use? We need someone to document our community initiatives and share the real stories of people we help." Vanessa blinked in surprise. "You're offering me a job? After what I did?" Eleanor's eyes were kind but firm. "Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow from their mistakes. That includes you, and it includes this company." She turned back to address the entire room. "Walker Enterprises lost its way while I was gone. Today, we begin finding our path again." She closed her folder. "Now, shall we get to work?" 6 months passed since that memorable shareholders' meeting at the Grand Oasis Resort. The story of Eleanor Walker, the billionaire who lived as a homeless woman to understand the true impact of her company, had captured public imagination. News outlets ran special features, social media buzzed with discussions, and business schools added her approach to their ethics courses. On a sunny afternoon, Eleanor walked slowly through the lobby of the Grand Oasis Resort, no longer needing her cane. The place looked different now, not just in decoration, but in spirit. Staff members greeted guests with genuine smiles rather than rehearsed phrases. Near the entrance, a new sign announced the Second Chance program, the training initiative for homeless individuals that had already helped 30 people find stable employment. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Walker," called the receptionist, a middle-aged woman named Judy who had joined through the Second Chance program. 3 months ago, she had been living in her car after losing her home to medical bills. Today, she had an apartment, healthcare benefits, and growing confidence. "Hello, Judy. How's your son doing at his new school?" Eleanor asked, stopping to chat. "Loving it. His teacher says he's catching up fast," Judy beamed. Eleanor continued toward the resort's restaurant, which had been renamed Walker's Kitchen. Inside, the atmosphere was welcoming rather than exclusive. The menu now featured more affordable options alongside luxury dishes, making it accessible to local families while still attracting wealthy visitors. In the corner, Blake Thompson, the former resort manager who had tried to throw Eleanor out, was training a new group of employees. His initial fear of being fired had transformed into genuine commitment to the company's new direction after Eleanor gave him the chance to prove himself. "Remember," he told the trainees, "every guest deserves respect, regardless of appearance or background." Eleanor smiled to herself as she took a seat by the window. The lesson had been learned. Rita appeared, no longer in a waitress uniform, but dressed professionally. She was finishing her nursing degree while working part-time as the coordinator for the resort's new community health initiatives. "The clinic space is almost ready," Rita reported excitedly as she sat across from Eleanor. "We'll be able to offer free health screenings to local residents starting next month." "Wonderful," Eleanor replied. "And how are your studies going?" "Challenging but good. The scholarship changed everything. I can focus on learning instead of worrying about bills." As they chatted, Vanessa Carter entered the restaurant. The once spoiled socialite now looked more grounded, her designer clothes replaced by business casual attire. She spotted Eleanor and approached the table. "Mrs. Walker, I've finished the video about our first graduation ceremony," she said, placing a tablet on the table. "Would you like to see it?" The screen showed footage of 5 formerly homeless individuals receiving certificates after completing the resort's culinary training program. Their faces shone with pride as family members applauded. "You've done beautiful work, Vanessa," Eleanor said sincerely. Vanessa's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Walker, I need to thank you again. Most people would have fired me after what I did. Instead, you gave me a chance to become someone better." Eleanor shook her head. Everyone deserves the opportunity to grow, dear. 6 months ago, you couldn't see past appearances. Now you're helping others tell their stories with dignity. After Vanessa left, Rita looked thoughtfully at Eleanor. You know, when I first met you in that break room, I never imagined all this would happen. Life takes unexpected turns, Eleanor agreed. When Thomas died 20 years ago, I felt lost. Our company was growing, but its soul was shrinking. I needed to see the world from a different perspective. But why live on the streets? You could have just visited as yourself. Eleanor smiled. People behave differently when they know they're being watched, especially by someone with power. I wanted to see the unfiltered truth. She gestured around the restaurant. And now we're rebuilding with that truth as our foundation. Later that afternoon, Eleanor attended a board meeting in the same conference room where she had announced her return 6 months earlier. Reports showed that while some wealthy clients had initially left due to the changes, they had been replaced by new customers drawn to the company's ethical approach. Overall profits had dipped slightly, but employee turnover had dropped dramatically, saving significant hiring and training costs. How community programs are generating positive publicity worth millions in advertising, the marketing director reported, and staff satisfaction scores are at an all-time high. After the meeting, Eleanor walked through the resort gardens, now open to local residents as a public park. Children played on new playground equipment while parents chatted on benches. An elderly man recognized Eleanor and tipped his hat respectfully. As the sun began to set, Eleanor made her way to the beach. She slipped off her shoes to feel the sand between her toes, something she had often done during her years living simply. The waves washed against the shore in a soothing rhythm. Robert Wilson joined her, standing respectfully at a distance until she noticed him. The quarterly numbers look good, he said. The board is starting to see that ethics and profit aren't enemies. Eleanor nodded. It takes time to change deeply rooted thinking, but we're getting there. Will you stay with us now? Robert asked hesitantly. Or will you disappear again? Eleanor looked out at the horizon. I'll stay, but not in the presidential suite. I've purchased a small cottage in town. Grand enough for comfort, simple enough for clarity. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from founding a company with Thomas, to losing her way after his death, to finding purpose again by walking among those society often ignored. The leather satchel that had carried her few possessions now sat in her office as a reminder of where she had been and why it mattered. The true measure of success, Eleanor said quietly, isn't what we gain, but what we give. It took me 80 years and losing everything to truly understand that. As darkness fell, lights came on along the boardwalk, new lamps installed as part of the resort's community improvements. In their glow, people from all walks of life strolled together, no longer separated by invisible barriers of wealth and status. Eleanor Walker smiled. This was the legacy she had always wanted.